So I'd like to welcome Nora Princiotti. Thank you so much for taking time out of what is a very, very busy schedule you have, especially in the NFL season. So thank you so much for taking some time out for us today.
Absolutely.
So I wanted to ask you about your sort of professional path in terms of how you ended up in the position you're in now with covering the NFL for The Ringer, but also even how you ended up in sports journalism altogether.
Yeah. So it's funny. Didn't crystallize for me that I wanted to go into media at all or sports media until at least midway through college. But I can always trace it back a little bit. And like when I was really little, I loved, we would record like VHS tapes of the Olympics and I would watch them back over and over again. And I was just sort of obsessive about some of that stuff. So there were kernels that in hindsight, I can go, oh, it makes sense that I do this now. But I was always, at Andover certainly, and early in college and in middle school before that, I was very much like, I liked every subject. Whatever I was doing the best in was probably my favorite at any given time. I realized probably midway through Andover that I really loved to write and that was one of my better skills. So I started sort of angling myself towards figuring out what might be a way to use that I was actually interested in. But I joined my college paper when I was a freshman because I thought I should join some clubs. And I hadn't written for the Philippian other than maybe one or two things because one of my friends was an editor when I was in Andover. But I always thought it seemed cool. And I'm pretty, I definitely, like, I love to write, but I've never been the type where I could go off to a cabin in the woods and come out with a manuscript. Like, I need people around me. I need to sort of have, like, reporting is a very good way for me to write because it gives me that sort of human interaction and analysis piece. So I started doing it in college, and I did sports stories. I did news stories. I ended up being the sports editor of my college paper and started to do, I went to GW in DC, which is, it's a great city to be doing media stuff because I could write a couple of freelance pieces for the AP. I could go to stuff with the professional teams around there. And I knew I loved it. And so sort of gradually, probably my junior and senior year, I felt like I was going to try to do it at least for a little bit after I graduated. I didn't know if it was going to be something that I wanted to do forever. And that could have been, I think at the time, if you'd asked me, I would have said, I could do sports for a couple of years and then I might want to be a news reporter. But I also might have said, I don't know if I want to do journalism forever. And part of that, frankly, was that I just, it was a tough job market. I didn't know that it was going to be like the most sustainable path, but the more I did it, I really love it. And so I felt like I'm going to give this a go. I'm going to see, I'll do it until they tell me I can't do it anymore. Right. And so the best thing that happened to me was that I got an internship at the Boston Globe for the summer after I graduated college in the sports department. And I actually didn't get it originally. My old boss, Joe Sullivan, who's like one of my absolute favorite people in the world, had called me to say, you were the runner-up for this, but stay in touch. We really liked your stuff. And I was like, okay, cool. Like, gotta go figure something else out to do. And then a couple months later, he called me back and said, hey, do you have a job? And I was like, no, don't rub it in. And he said, I kept thinking about sort of wanting to hire you. And so I talked to the news people and they agreed to take one fewer intern so that we could have two in sports. So I ended up really lucking out there. And then actually the other person didn't end up doing the internship. So it was me. And I got really lucky again at the end of that because they needed someone to help cover the Patriots. And so in September, after I had graduated, Joe asked me if I wanted to stay through the NFL season, extend my internship, but just cover the Patriots.
So the internship,
so it was like,
I'm sorry,
go
the
ahead.
internship was for the summer then, or?
Yeah, it was just supposed to be,
Oh, wow.
June through August. And then I was going to have to go like find a real job.
Oh, wow. I thought it
And
was initially, in sort of perusing your bio, your resume, I thought that was sort of might have been like a year-long professional like position as an internship. But so you ended up you stretched a summer internship, and then it was like, oh, by the way, can you stay on? And oh, by the way, staying on will entail traveling with the Patriots.
Yeah, it was sort of unreal. I remember, like Joe's an old newspaper guy who's there through all the boom years when newspapers could do whatever they wanted. And I think in this case, they were sort of like, okay, we probably can't hire another full-time person, but we need a warm body. So like, let's keep the intern around. And so I remember him calling me and being like, I really want to find a way to have a position for you, but the way that we can make this work is to do this right now, and you'll just cover the team and you'll do X, Y, and Z. And he sounded almost a little apologetic. Meanwhile, I am someone who entered the journalism market in 2016 and was like fist pumping in my car, being like, this is insane. I can't believe I get to do this. This is so awesome. And that was the 2016 season. So that, by the end of it, they came back to beat the Falcons in the Super Bowl. I was like, please, somebody pinch me. This is unbelievable.
And you're there in the press box at the Super Bowl.
In Houston.
Wow.
In Houston. And everybody, I'd written a completely different story and had to rip it up. And everybody kept looking over at me and being like, it is all downhill from here. Like, you will never top this as long as you work in this industry. So that was kind of, at that point, I was totally hooked and sold. And I went back to DC for a few months, but by the next season, the 2017 season, the Globe had hired me full-time to cover the Patriots. So I did that the last 3 seasons as a beat reporter. And then just this last June was when I started The Ringer.
Yeah, that's an incredible story. And I did want to delve a little bit sort of out of even personal curiosity, like you hear the term beat writer or beat reporter. Yeah. And although I consider myself a big sports fan and I read some of the professional teams I'm interested in, I certainly sort of am familiar enough with who the quote beat reporters are for those teams in different leagues. I still, though I'm not sure exactly what a beat reporter does, in the sense that, is it someone who really is always traveling with said team?
Yeah, so it's kind of like, I think the word comes from like beating a path. Mm-hmm. So it's like you would be, if the State House was your beat, you would be like walking in front of the State House all the time. So like you're beating a path there. That might be wrong. But that's what's in my brain somewhere. But it's also kind of like, if you think of like a beat in music, it's very even, right? It's very regular. You're there all the time. So a beat reporter's job is just to cover everything that is going on with a given team. So when I was on the Patriots beat, I was there every day that my pass allowed me to get through the gates, and you cover every press conference, you cover every game. It's not like, for instance, my job now is more selective, I guess is what you'd say. We're all, look around the league, look around all the different teams, look at what's going on with them and think, oh, this is what I want to write about. That game is particularly interesting. I should focus on that. Mm-hmm. But you end up relying on the work of beat reporters all the time, right? Because I don't have eyes and ears in 32 teams every day of the week. So it's kind of that responsibility for knowing the minutia and knowing, you know, the practice squad transactions and minor injury status things, but especially over time, when you do know all that granular detail, the people who are in those roles end up getting all of this institutional knowledge so that when a big thing happens, all of the little stuff informs the big stuff. So it's like you have a really good perspective on both. Not really. Because I'd done enough sports coverage that I never found it particularly challenging to switch into reporter mode. I think probably a couple years prior I would have, but I think I had enough of the muscle memory of sort of understanding how your perspective changes when you're in that role. And it's actually not particularly hard because you have such an interest in just rooting for whatever the best story is, that it was never something that I felt like I needed to sort of force myself to do. It just happened pretty naturally and I will totally, you know, I'm the first person to cop to, if you have a great relationship with someone, you want to see them succeed. Like there are tons of Patriots players who you know, whether it was developing a personal friendship with them or just sort of knowing who they were as people and thinking very highly of them and wanting good things to happen to them, like you never lose those elements, but the rah, I just want them to win no matter what it is. Yeah. Like that stuff gets eclipsed very easily, even by stuff that's as simple as, oh, well, if they win or lose this game, it's going to impact seating in this way. And then I might get to go to a city where my friend lives, or then maybe we're going to Florida instead of, you know, Chicago in January, and that's better. So like all those little, I was rooting for me. It's the best way to put it. Well, so it's a matter of degree in some cases. Like I think you look at when Tom Coughlin was in the league, his teams had sort of similar rigid adherence to discipline. Some of the teams like the Lions that have a lot of former Patriots employees running that team can be similar in certain ways. I think in those cases, again, that's where it's a matter of degree, right? Because they might follow the same formula, but not necessarily to the same extent, also not necessarily to the same impact, frankly, because one of the things that works so well in New England is that their track record allows them to make those asks of players, right? To, you know, maybe not show as much of their personalities all the time, which people in general want to do, right? So you kind of have to, it's easier for them to argue that the trade-off is worth it because of what they've accomplished. But then you can look at other programs that, now nobody's had the same success that the Patriots have had, but you can look at other really, really strong organizations, like for instance, the Seahawks. That's a completely different culture, completely. And Pete Carroll's coaching philosophy is wildly different from Bill Belichick's. And there's chaos in that team a lot of the time, right? Like players get in fights before huge games and it all kind of works out in the wash, and they've had a ton of success too. So there's definitely no one way to do it. I would say the Patriots are fundamentally different from a lot of teams, but there are some where they follow a similar formula. But I think it's really tough when you don't have the foundation of players expect to win Super Bowls when they play there. So they're just a little bit more willing to, you know, tamp whatever it is they want to tamp back in exchange for being a part of that.
Yeah. I mean, it is one thing that sticks out to me, being as old as I am and seeing, like, you know, a lot of different sort of NFL eras, is that it is pretty interesting to see the success that Belichick's had as the sort of GM and coach. And
yeah,
it's easy for me to make this point right now because we just had a sort of a very, you know, we had a crash and burn scenario in Houston of somebody who didn't pull that off. So,
yeah.
you know, do you think that there's any sort of particular traits or, you know, or philosophies, if you will, that Belichick's taken where he's been able to pull that dual role off so well?
Yeah, I think so. And maybe this surprises some people, maybe especially for an Andover audience that probably knows him a little bit, this wouldn't, but there is an egolessness to a lot of his personnel decisions. I think that's actually, to me, most clearly illustrated by the players that they move on from, because he makes mistakes. You know, Nick Caserio makes mistakes. Everybody in that personnel department makes mistakes just like everybody else. But they will, for instance, admit failure on even high draft picks. Like you think of a Duke Dawson or a Jordan Richards, some of the defensive backs that they've drafted that just haven't worked out. They will move on and just cut their losses, I think, sooner than a lot of places will, because they'll just get so caught up in saying, well, we invested the draft pick and we've got to find a way to make this work. And we must have been right. We did all this work. We did all this preparation. We thought that was a good player. And I think there's a real willingness to just say, you know what, we were wrong. And maybe that guy would be better somewhere else anyway. And we should just try to get whatever value we can and keep going. So I think that's part of it. I also think that they have a really good whole setup. Like Nick Caserio could certainly be a general manager somewhere and probably will be at some point. But I mean, you know, if we're talking about Houston, like he's certainly a candidate there, but for whatever set of reasons, he hasn't left yet, and he's been fine waiting this long and not having the final say, but still being a really huge part of how they evaluate players and how they choose who to bring into the organization. So I don't think it's like Belichick certainly delegates a lot. So while the buck certainly stops with him, I think it's knowing sort of when to move on and also not being totally overloaded with just more than one person can handle, because being a coach is a huge job. Being a general manager is a huge job. You can be the person who has final say, but there's actually no one in the entire league that does literally all of the work of those two things.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's just not possible, I would imagine.
Yeah, no. Sometimes it's not even somebody making an introduction, or I knew that they went to Andover. I'll just, like, I think, so Shane Waldron is a coach for the Rams, and I met him at a combine a few years ago, and I don't think maybe I did know, maybe Jenny Savino or somebody had told me, but I just happened to meet him and was like, wait, hey, did you go to Andover? Whoa, crazy. So it's really fun to run into those guys. Kyle O'Brien, who's in personnel with the Lions, I've seen a bunch. I think the last time I saw him was training camp last year. The Patriots did joint practices in Detroit, so we were up there for a little while and saw him. Obviously, Belichick and Ernie Adams, I've had the opportunity to be around a bunch, and that's really cool. Zach Diossi, I know I've met a bunch of times, I think mostly at Andover things. I'm trying to think if I've ever run into him in an NFL environment. And then also not exactly football related, but journalism and sports. Richard Phelps, Mr. Phelps,
Mm-hmm.
was super involved with the Globe too. So I'd gotten a couple of chances to talk to him because of that. And there's just, it really is kind of amazing to realize how many Andover alums are dotted around the NFL, because it wasn't something that, like, I run into Andover alums in so many different areas of life all the time. And like my best friends are still people that I went to Andover with. But that was one area where it had just never occurred to me how frequently that was going to happen. So it's very cool. Yeah. So it's funny. Like, I think we talked earlier about, I didn't know that I wanted to be a journalist until pretty late in college, but it really was like a real, when I was in English 300, I had a teacher, Mr. Manchell, who was a teaching fellow, who was fantastic. And that class was huge for me. One, I didn't meet my best friend in that class, but a girl named Sammy Maris, who was in my Andover class, is my best friend in the whole world to this day. But that was the class we took together where we were like, oh, we really like each other. We should be friends. So it's like this crazy, but it was also the class where I started really realizing that I was good at writing, mm-hmm. and that I was good at communicating thoughts and analysis, like, on paper. And I do remember him saying to me once, like, you should think about doing this in college, and just thinking to myself, well, that's really nice and that's really flattering. And I've never really had someone pull me aside and be like, you might want to do this in your life. But I was like, so then what do you do if you study English? What do you do after that? And I couldn't figure it out. And so now I look back at that and I'm like, this is what you do. Or like, there's a lot of things you can do, but this is one of them. And that class totally planted the seed. And it's also funny that, Sammy and I became really close after doing that together. So I think about that course a lot. And then besides that, it's Andover's just, it's a place that I feel like gave me a lot of tools and teaching me how to think and teaching me how to navigate. Like, you have X set of information. How are you going to choose sort of how you analyze it? It also, I had a prefect, my junior year, Annie Pates, who, when I moved to Boston, she was like my first real friend here. And now my whole sort of social community and all the people that I have around me here have built out of that relationship. So there's so many ways, certainly professionally, but also personally, where it's like most things that I think are valuable or effective in my life can be traced back to Andover in some way.
Hey Nora, Trey here. Just wanted to reach out and ask a couple of questions. So first and foremost, love your article about the team of 1970 and the Boston Globe. Thought that was amazing. So for just the first question there is, how did you come up with that idea, that format to write that story? I thought it was done in a way that is so creative. So I'm very interested to hear that.
Yeah, so that was really fun to work on. I think the genesis of that was basically like, I'd covered the Patriots for a few years at that point. And look, Bill Belichick's been a coach for a really long time, and a lot of people have written a lot of things about him. And there's sort of, a feeling as a reporter and as a journalist where you want to write something that nobody else has done yet, or that can actually be like a new, different thing. And I'd thought about just kind of like that time in his life. And then I think I realized, and I might have been talking to Jenny or somebody, but who reminded me that team was undefeated. So I thought, oh, well, maybe I'll do a kind of oral history of that season would be a cool way to go about it. And the more that I learned about it, it was just, it's an interesting time to be a student in America, right? In 1970, like there were all these different interesting angles to it. And the funny thing was that it ended up being sort of like oral history adjacent because, and I say this with a lot of love, Andover people love to talk about their old Andover sports teams.
No.
So,
including,
which is great. And
including like for somebody who has sorry to interrupt, but somebody who has a reputation as such a curmudgeon, and for somebody who really doesn't, necessarily enjoy dealing with the media, I think that Bill Belichick is somebody who really enjoys talking about his time at Andover, the sports teams, like be they lacrosse or football. Anyway,
I think I helped myself in that one because I remember during training camp going to chat with him about it, and Stacey James, who runs PR for the Patriots, like pulled me into the sort of back tunnel, and he came out and he was like basically quizzing me on who I'd talked to. But I'd done all of the preliminary reporting and I'd talked to basically everybody because I wanted Bill to be towards the end so that if there were any stories or anything that I wanted to be able to have a conversation with him about, I would already know that stuff. So he was going through and he was like, well, have you talked to Buzzy Bissinger and like all these different people? And I was able to be like, yes. And I think, he likes when people are prepared. So I felt really good about that. But yeah, I think when I did the interviews, transcribed, and I actually, I had a lot of help transcribing those for that piece, because I think that there must have been, tens of thousands of words.
Wow.
So I realized that I couldn't do it in a pure oral history format because it would have been a 15,000 word article. So I used a lot of direct quotes so that it would sort of have the feel of being in the voices of the people who were there. But then I also did paraphrase a lot just to kind of keep the trains on the track.
Do you see the NFL season being able to basically be completed as we're already starting to see an increase in people contracting the coronavirus, and also with the NBA success using the bubble and the NFL not being able to do that? Do you think that there is a way that we can have a full season or watch a full season of the NFL? Thank you.
Hi, Ms. Princiotti. There's been some talk about how the league will handle games that have been postponed due to COVID outbreaks. I was just wondering how you think the league will handle this, and if they choose to play some makeup games in a Week 18, how that might affect one seeds who are already getting the first round bye. Thanks.
Hi, Ms. Princiotti. I had a question regarding the Tennessee Titans. I know they have lots of COVID cases, and if they continue to miss games, I was wondering how that might affect the schedule, and I was also wondering how that would affect the playoff seeding because they play less games, and what would that mean for the league? Thank you.
So I think the interesting thing about how the NFL's handled the outbreak in Tennessee and some of the other cases that have popped up around the league over the last couple of weeks is that they seem pretty committed, if it ends up being possible, to preserving a relatively normal 17-week schedule. So games have been moved 1, 2, 3, 4 days back or up, and they've been moved into bye weeks that can be switched around fairly neatly. But so far, at least, they've seemed like they don't want to tack on a week 18, a week 19 at the end of the schedule. Now we'll see if they're able to get through the year without doing that. But it does seem like there's a reluctance to do that, which is interesting to me, frankly, just because it would seem to solve a lot of problems if they were okay to do that. And, you know, there's the possibility of you can take out the bye week after conference championship games if that's a helpful way to fit that in. Obviously, players wouldn't love that, and there is some injury concern with that, but it's at least possible. Or they don't want to move the Super Bowl if they don't have to, but they do have alternate dates reserved for that. So to me, that's been interesting just because I've felt like the last couple of weeks have shown just how difficult it is to prevent spread once somebody on a team does have the coronavirus. But at the same time, I think their actions have shown that they at least, and we'll find out if this is right or wrong, but they seem to believe that they can get through it by making these sort of minor schedule tweaks instead of making a big change and tacking on a lot of weeks at the end of the season. There's been a real emphasis on player discipline and team discipline, which I think is right. And if you see stuff like what happened in Tennessee, where the Titans did have a lot of workouts that they weren't supposed to have, and now they have upwards of 20 cases, you know, I frankly think it makes a lot of sense to have some fairly severe punishments for those things. And if they end up needing to forfeit games, I mean, I don't think that it's really fair to have teams like the Bills and the Steelers, who have so far been pretty clean, having condensed schedules and maybe playing games on very little rest because of what happened to another team. At the same time, I do think that what's been getting lost in some of the emphasis on who's adhering to the protocols, what are the punishments going to be for non-compliance, is that there is room within the protocols as they're written for the virus to spread. Because, you know, I'm not a doctor, but I think at this point we're all fairly fluent in things like the incubation period and how you don't necessarily have to be, you can test negative in the morning and you can be contagious by the afternoon. There are ways where a team that followed the rules perfectly could still spread it. Mm-hmm. So while I think it's totally fair to have, you know, whether it's fines, draft picks, whatever, I also just am curious to see if we'll ever see an acknowledgement from the league that you could do everything perfectly and still get it. And so it's not necessarily, if there's an outbreak somewhere or isolated cases somewhere, I don't know that it's necessarily a perfect solution to be like, well, we're going to come up with the steepest punishment possible because you must have done something horribly wrong, because that's just not true.
And I do have to right now plug, you wrote a wonderful preseason piece about COVID. And then you followed up with that. And then on you and your coworker, Kevin Clark, there's been incredible sort of insightful information from NFL insiders on that. So I have to tell everybody who wants to do this.
We love a Ringer NFL show plug. Yeah. Well, so for the first part of that, for the regular season, I think the idea of a bubble was brought up in a sort of cursory way because they want to think about, you know, it's an unprecedented situation. So I think they thought about most of their options. I think the idea of a regular season bubble was deemed just impractical pretty quickly. You know, NFL teams are a lot bigger than basketball teams. The spaces that they need, the fields are a lot bigger too, and there aren't that many places that have a lot of NFL quality fields within a small area. So practically speaking, to bubble 32 teams and all the personnel that they need to support them would have been just immensely challenging. And I think they decided pretty quickly that that wasn't going to be a good situation. I absolutely think that you could see them revisit it for the playoffs. And I believe that's been brought up at least as something worth considering in some meetings that the owners and top level team execs have had with the league recently. So whether that could be, you know, there's places in Texas that have a lot of high quality football stadiums within a pretty contained area, and also have a decent amount of hotel rooms available and all the stuff that you need to, you know, make it work logistically. So I think that's possible. And you'd probably see Texas or California would probably be most likely to have the resources to support an NFL playoff bubble. To answer the other part of that, yeah, they are telling players don't go out to dinner. You know, you don't know to what degree that's able to be enforced, but I think there's been a pretty strong emphasis among teams for guys to just go home and stay home. The thing is, since they're not doing a bubble, they're going home to families. And, you know, if somebody's wife has to go to the grocery store, or kids are, I mean, I don't think anybody's really in school at this point, but they're going home to families who are, I think, being probably in general as careful as they can be, but are still members of communities and out in the world. So that's the real difference between bubbling and not bubbling, right? Is like, you can have all 2,000 plus NFL players be perfect and never go to a restaurant, never do anything like that, but they live in their homes and their communities. So there is some degree of potential for, you know, something getting in somewhere through a crack.
Sure.
If they're not going to do that.
Hi, Ms. Princiotti. This season, there are a lot of injuries in the league. How much of that would you contribute to a lack of preseason?
Probably has something to do with it. And I would have to look up where the injury numbers are through 4 weeks at this point. I think after the Players Association compared a lot of the risk this year to the season in 2011 that came after the lockout. And there was a real spike in soft tissue injuries, especially that year. And I think they were anticipating that this year could be even worse, actually, because at least during the lockout, like, most gyms were open. And I know one of the last stories that I did when I was still at the Globe was about how players were finding ways to train. And I was really surprised in reporting that actually how little guys had at home, because if you think about it, they can go to their team facilities. A lot of them, if they live near where they went to college, they can go to their college facilities, or they just go to a really nice gym. So they're used to doing that. So they don't necessarily have, you know, the crazy home gyms that maybe I had expected that some people would have. And I was having conversations with trainers and with players who were saying that for somebody like an offensive lineman who, you know, they need large amounts of weight to get the resistance that their bodies need to actually train. They can't, you know, you can't do air squats and prepare to block a 285-pound defensive end or whatever it is. Like, it's just not going to work. Guys were telling me that they were pushing cars like up their driveways and just finding all this crazy stuff to do. So I think it really was a very different off season in terms of the sort of ability to train themselves physically. So it probably does have something to do with it. I know that the first week of the season, interestingly enough, there weren't really that many big injuries. And then week 2, it just was like people one after another. It was, I mean, I remember, you know, sitting watching games that Sunday, just being like, what is going on here? So it probably, unfortunately, does have something to do with it. Well, it's interesting because I actually thought before the season, you know, offense is more planned out, right? It's more scripted. Defense is reactive. So I wondered what it would look like, but I thought that there would actually be a chance that the defenses might be in a good position because they're responding to what the other side does in a way that offense isn't. So whether that was going to be made easier by the fact that like you just can kind of go out there and see what you see and go after it, and that's oversimplifying things. But I wondered actually if they might be in a better position. Obviously, we've seen that that's not the case. I think one of the things that's helped that is that the lack of crowd noise in stadiums is helping offenses communicate really clearly. And so far, defenses haven't done a ton by just picking up what their signals are. And, you know, whether that comes around in the playoffs, if somebody plays a team for a second time, maybe, or in some of the divisional games later in the year, that might start to be a thing. But I think the bigger deal is, one, holding calls are way down. That helps offenses. Two, there's in general a lot of coaches who are more willing to be aggressive. So, you know, you go for a fourth down and either you convert it and that is more likely to lead to scoring, or you don't convert it and your opponent has better field position probably because of that, relative to if you punted or you know, settled for a field goal and then had to kick off. So that aggressiveness promotes scoring in both directions, which is, I think, one reason why the numbers have been boosted. And then you also just look around the league and the quarterback play in general is incredibly high. So there's guys like Aaron Rodgers and Russell Wilson who've been some of the best quarterbacks in football for a long time, but whose teams are, one, reliant on them scoring 30 plus points a game because their defenses aren't great. And two, you have, you know, particularly in Wilson's case, a team that for a long time has been reluctant to just like put the game in his hands on a regular basis. All of a sudden, not running as much on early downs, asking him to throw a really high volume of passes, taking advantage of what a great deep ball passer he is. And so that's contributed to some of the explosive offensive numbers. But then you can look way down at teams that aren't good teams, but who are still getting good quarterback play, like the Falcons, the Jaguars, the Lions. Like there are some sort of bottom feeder teams who are still getting, in some cases, efficient play and like good sort of counting stats from those guys. In other cases, it's maybe just sort of the counting numbers, but either way, it's, you know, I think it's sort of like a perfect storm of why we've seen so much scoring, because it really has been. I mean, I think there are, you know, the most touchdowns through the first 3 weeks or something, and it's continued.
Could talk NFL with you all day, and I really appreciate your insights on that. But I feel like I'd be remiss, anyone who's sort of followed you, whether that's on social media or on any of the shows you've been a guest or a host on, knows your affinity for Taylor Swift. And then
I knew this was coming.
I was trying to think of what's a question that I could ask you that you might not have been asked before, because you get favorite song off every album, favorite album. I think you've even done deep dives into live performances. How do you think her collaborations compare to the rest of her body of work? And then second, the follow-up question to that to be is, could you name what you think are her top 5 collaborations?
Yeah. Okay. So this is a really interesting subject, because I don't think that most of her collaborations are not that great, at least compared to the rest of her work. And like her sort of, at least to me, her personality and her ability to like convey emotion just through the tenor of her voice is so specific, and so like you just know that a Taylor Swift song is a Taylor Swift song. I think it's often hard for that to mesh with other people. And then sometimes they think she's had a weird tendency to kind of like take a back seat in a lot of duets. Like she once did this song with a kind of emo pop punky band called Boys Like Girls, where she like doesn't sing until the second verse. And I find it so odd, because it's like the star power between those two, you know, no offense to Boys Like Girls, but between those two entities is so different, that it's like, why wouldn't you want to lead with her? I always find that strange. I believe I would bet things that are very important to me on the existence somewhere on some digital file in some record studio, a Taylor Swift Drake collaboration, which like I need to hear, like just the two, although maybe I don't need to hear it, because maybe the first time anybody hears that, like it sees the light of day, the world just explodes because it's like too much people who are in their feelings. So I really, that one, I do like, so she's a song called Bad Blood, which I don't really like. And then they tried to redo it and have Kendrick Lamar do a verse on it. And it kind of helped, but not really. There is a song called Endgame, on, is that on Lover or on Reputation? That has Future and Ed Sheeran on it. And that, I remember looking at that track listing and being like, how is this going to work? And it actually kind of does. It's not in my top 10 or top 15 favorite songs of hers, but I think that's a pretty good one. The one with, on her new album, Folklore, there's a collaboration with Bon Iver. That one I think is pretty good. It's, again, frankly, like none of these are my favorite Taylor Swift songs. She actually does. I'm not like the biggest Ed Sheeran fan, but I think the two of them work pretty well together. So she has a song with him called Everything Has Changed that I think is pretty good. So where am I? If I'm not including Bad Blood because I don't think that one's very good. She did a song with Zayn, that I think is okay. So that might've been 4, but those are some okay ones. And number 1 is the unheard Drake collaboration that I'm positive exists. That is number 1 in my heart. It is absolutely, like, I'm positive that's real.
All right, why are you positive about this?
Well, so one, they're like aligned in some ways. Like she's on a couple different occasions, especially talking about sort of like record label stuff and artist streaming rights. Like she's mentioned in a very positive way, like, think about how Drake did this. Like he's so great. So there's been some hinting that there's like a positive relationship there. And I just think, I mean, people who are sort of just extra in that way, like there's 2 hugely popular artists, right? So like there's a lot of people who would listen to that. And 2, emotionally, they must mesh together so well. I'm just positive.
What do you think might be happening with the sort of a Selena Gomez duet?
Oh, yeah, that's it. I don't know. I wonder. She does. So one of the she doesn't. The friends of hers that, like, Ed Sheeran's really the only sort of Taylor squad member person that she's collaborated with a bunch. I wonder if she ever will write Selena Gomez a song. I can see that a little bit more easily than I can see them doing a duet together. And I don't really know why. I wonder if it's like, you know,
well,
you don't need to mix those two things, but like a couple of years ago, she wrote a song called Better Man, which was like much more going back to sort of like country roots kind of song. And she just sold it to a band called Little Big Town. And it was a country number 1 hit, like immediately. Mm-hmm. So like, she definitely still has that in her bag where she can just like write a song one afternoon and give it to someone else. And it's great. So I wonder if, like, I can see that happening for Selena Gomez.
I did a search for Marty Schottenheimer, and he has multiple mentions in hip hop songs. So. anyway, I just wanted to ask you about that this sort of almost the perception of them and from a more of a personality point of view rather than just success.
Yeah, well, that was funny about it, right? Because like that's so accepted as a part of hip hop culture and like in rap that it almost it comes across as strangely innocent, might be the wrong word, but at least normal. And the funniest thing was that there's a song Motorsport that has like a blatant Deflategate reference, and which the Dolphins after that Miami Miracle game a couple of years ago, they were like blasting that in their locker room. And who was it? I think Xavier Howard like posted lyrics from that on his Instagram. And it became a very minor kerfuffle, but a kerfuffle nonetheless. But you hear that song, right? And like, it doesn't sound that bad, I guess.
Yeah.
And because that kind of like rule bending and the win at all costs stuff, like that's cool in a lot of hip hop culture in a way where like in the NFL, it's, well, we didn't do anything and you got to be by the book and everything. So when I was reporting that story, I remember one day walking around the Patriots locker room and talking to guys about like, do they ever listen to that stuff and feel cool because it has lyrics that are sort of about them or about people they know. And one of the players that I was talking to was like trying to see how many songs, because I had a list of all the lyrics, and he was trying to think of as many as he could. And he brought up Motorsport, and then he starts going through it and he starts like saying the words, and then he was like, wait, not that one. And just got like so uncomfortable with me. All of a sudden I was like, yeah. It's cool.
Yeah, they got the memo from their PR department about anything Deflategate related. Yeah. So.
But that was like a fun little angle of that piece, was to explore what things that would be taboo in football are like less in other elements of culture, and that's one where the mix of that I thought was interesting.
Yeah, the sheer number of references is incredible. Like I said, like you just take some average like old hip hop fan like me, and instantly I'm like, they missed this one, they missed that one, and because there's so many, and there's been
Marty Schottenheimer. That's crazy.
No, but I even mean just the Brady and the Patriots and Belichick.
Yeah.
The Belichick references are to me even more fascinating because it's a very reserved, like professional football coach. And my personal favorite reference that if anyone cares enough, they can look it up on their own, is a song by Rhapsody. One of just amazing, just a quick plug for Rhapsody as one of the greatest MCs, male or female right now. But anyway, like, and it's just so interesting to see. It's basically canon at this point in terms of referencing cold, calculated excellence or strategy. And
we know what it means, right? Yeah. Like that's the thing about rapping, right? Is you have to find these quick ways to get your point across. Mm-hmm. And so if there's something that's been like a fixture of sports culture or pop culture for a really long time that you can say, and maybe it can mean a couple, it can mean excellence, it can mean discipline, it can mean maybe being a little bit willing to break the rules or something, like those things it could be like one of a few different things, but in context, you're basically immediately going to know what they mean. So I think that's part of it, right? Is that it's like, it's helpful to these guys because instead of spelling out like something really awesome that wins a lot, you just say Tom Brady. I miss Andover dearly and I love it very much. So I'm happy to do this. And also I'll just put it out there. If anyone ever needs anything or wants to talk about journalism or sports media or just chat, like I'm around.
All right. Thank you so much, Nora. I really appreciate it. Take care.
Absolutely.